Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Punt Intended podcast, a Dynasty fantasy basketball podcast and a sports ethos production presented by FanDuel. As always, I am your host, Mark C., the Dynasty leader over at Sports Ethos. On today's episode, I am pleased to bring on special guest Zach of Dizzle Dynasty to discuss some general Dynasty philosophies. How does one balance so many different factors when ranking players and assessing these players against one another? How does a manager even go about evaluating their own dynasty team and determine what direction their team should go? How can you find hidden talents on waiver wires or on other people's rosters before everyone else catches on that this player is actually a hidden gem? We'll get into all those questions and more. But first, a little housekeeping. You can find me over on Blue Sky at Mark C Sports Ethos and on Twitter at MacAttack145. My Dynasty writings and rankings can be found at sportsethos.com, and you'll get access to all those rankings and articles with an NBA Fantasy Pass subscription. But without further ado, let's go ahead and bring in Zach of Dizzle Dynasty. Zach, how you doing?
I'm doing really well, man. Thank you for having me on.
Of course. No, I love the content you all put out. And speaking of that content, you all recently put out some updated Dynasty rankings. And I kind of wanted to use that to frame the first part of the pod here, which how do you even start going about updating your rankings?
Loaded question for sure. It takes the short answer is it takes time and a lot of consideration of a lot of different things. I think for me, what it really comes down to is just finding the right combination of the stats, recent performance, what that performance kind of looks like on a macro level, and then also just kind of the soft factors of their team situation, how things are looking on the exterior for their team, contract situation, perception, age. There's a lot of different things that just go into it when you break it down. It's really difficult to, truth be told. And that's one of the reasons why, especially for my rankings, I try to put a lot of notes is because there's just a lot that goes into it. And I just like to kind of share like how I'm feeling now about that exact kind of player, because there's a lot of things that are just so arbitrary that go into how we rank these players that it's not easy. It's not easy for people to assess. It's not easy for, us analysts to assess. And so, it really just comes down to a variety of factors for me when putting it all together.
I actually love that you kind of just put all that information out there. And it may seem like a lot if you're listening, but truly, if you ever go about making rankings, it takes a good amount of time. Like I know when I go about it, I have to block out hours to kind of get myself in the framework and then say, okay, I'm going to crank out these next 20 to 30, 40 spots in my rankings. Definitely. And then all different like stats and things and contracts that you look at. I know I have like my tab group that is just here's surface level stats, here's more advanced stats, here is contract situations, and looking at that and then trying to just assess all those factors together. That's truly, I think, what you have to look at. And I love that you mentioned that you have notes in your rankings too, because that kind of gives that snapshot thought process at that time. What's going on? What are you kind of valuing, I guess, which factors you're looking at for that player specifically? Because some players may just be, hey, this might be short term, but you see the spike, they may have use and potential. There's just so many different directions, and it just depends on which ones you're weighing those more heavily, which player, or maybe it's a mix of all of those.
Yeah, no, it really is one of the things that I just try to focus on is just finding that like right balance. And truth be told, sometimes it's just not easy to do. Recently when I appeared on Noah Rubin's podcast, one of the guys that we had kind of talked about was Malik Monk. And, one of the things that I had mentioned even myself was, hey, I had ranked him pretty high. In my update, I believe it was my June or July update of my ranks. I had him as high as like 62. He was in my high 60s. On this most recent update that I put out in August, I had to bring him back down to the mid to low 70s or mid to high 70s. And really the reason for that was just because, I'm free to admit it, I was a prisoner of the moment. I felt like he was going to be able to sustain a lot of this high performance with De'Aaron Fox gone. I was thinking that he would be able to keep performing this high. And, part of what tells me that maybe I was a little bit too high, among other things, was that, you're seeing all this news about how Sacramento wants to trade Malik Monk, especially with a lot of this Jonathan Kuminga business. I mentioned it previously. We still don't really have a whole lot of resolution, but really just kind of illustrating the point that there's things like that you just have to kind of pay attention to. And even if there is certain overriding things like, I still firmly believe that Malik Monk is a really, really good player. But, when you kind of consider that they're still looking for their point guard of the future, despite the fact that I might think that Malik Monk could be a really good passer, and his numbers could, increase if they're kind of looking for this sort of by committee type situation with a point guard. It's just not going to, I don't think it's going to be the reality. It just kind of becomes one of those things that you have to consider a lot of these different factors. And like I said, for me, it's just one of those things I have to kind of own and say, I was a prisoner of the moment. This is something that I kind of believed at the time that I don't as much now. And this is kind of why I'm shifting them down. And so, it's about that consideration. It's about just kind of breaking down those new tidbits of information and just how we kind of react to them that, and again, it's an arbitrary thing, 60 versus 70. But in the grand scheme of things, when you're considering this stuff, it does make a difference.
I think you're almost being a little humble with Malik Monk because the Kings have gone back to being the Kings.
Right.
I personally don't agree with most of their offseason, if not everything they've done. And yeah, I mean, Monk's maybe not the perfect point guard, but I think he's better than what they've done with their resources, with getting to the shooter and making all the machinations. So I guess I'm going to surprise you a bit of a question then. How do you go about judging, well, here's my individual read of the, raw talent level of a player versus, okay, this is a very unfortunate situation. Malik Monk to the Kings. You could say Keon Ellis on the Kings. Maybe Jonathan Kuminga on the Warriors brings that to mind. Players like that where maybe we think the talent is better or maybe worse than the situation, but the situation is just not ideal for them.
Yeah, it's hard to assess that, especially. And I think that's one of those things that you just have to there's certain times where you do have to judge almost that talent versus situation. And that's one of the things to consider as well. And I think, for me, that's why I didn't, drastically bring Malik Monk down a lot, is because I think he's a very talented player. And, despite the fact that I do see this information of which they think what they do. And, like you said, I fully disagree with that decision as well. I think it would be in a vacuum a mistake if they did some sort of move where it'd be Malik Monk and picks or whatever it may be for Jonathan Kuminga. It really just does it comes down to a talent thing. I think talent does really matter in those things. And I think it's just kind of part of playing that game. I mean, that's part of the reason why so many people still took Reed Shepherd, as high as first or second overall in 2024, despite having Jalen Green, despite having, Amen Thompson. There's just this level of talent that sometimes you have to acknowledge and fully keep, high up in your ranks, because the reality is that, in a lot of cases, this talent is going to reveal itself in some capacity, even well before they get the full runway to do so. Perfect example being Tyrese Halliburton. We had seen all of these flashes for so long in Sacramento, and eventually he was traded, and well, there you go. So sometimes it just kind of comes down to just assessing that talent and, what it looks like in that situation, even if it feels a little bit buried right now.
Yeah, so I mean, you basically just said Reed Shepherd's going to be the next Tyrese Halliburton. Can we?
Yes, yes, no, you heard it here, folks. You heard it here first, but buy him up.
Yeah, no, I think maybe that would be a little exaggerating, but I think that's a good example for Shepherd where, hey, we think he's still talented. It's just clearly the opportunity is not there, and that's okay for a season or two, and then maybe you start asking further questions.
Right.
Let's shift to just talking about ranking, or really just evaluating youth and younger players versus veterans. So, it seems like you seem to have a good mix of viewing both of those highly. You had LeBron James at 91, Kevin Durant at 40 in your rankings, but you also had plenty of rookies ranked highly. I believe about 10 within your top 115-ish.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you view evaluating these older veterans who maybe only have maybe 2 seasons of prime production left versus these rookies who the potential could theoretically be limitless?
Yeah, so it's hard to judge value in that capacity, I always think. In perfect example of that in terms of just evaluating that veteran value and just what those veterans bring is, my difference between someone like LeBron James at 91 versus KD at 40. It's one of those things where, even though KD is like 36, it's one of those things where I can kind of see, at least for me personally, I can see him playing at this high level, scoring over 20 points per game. And I think I even mentioned in my notes I can see him performing at this high level for a few more years. And so I feel comfortable being able to put him that high, knowing that, eventually, probably by the end of the season, I'll probably drop him down just realistically. But it kind of comes down to just evaluating how much time they have left and how much time they have left at that level to really get a grasp on it. I think, for me, and that's why LeBron James is such a hard evaluation, especially, and, truth be told, for the production at 91, it probably is too low. But I think it just kind of comes down to the fact that it's hard to know how long he has left. Sometimes you could believe that he has 1 year left. Maybe he's done at the end of this year. Maybe he has a couple more years, seeing him decrease over time. It's one of those things that's just hard to perfectly evaluate because there is no true way to know how much longer somebody has at a certain level or, how long someone has until they retire. So, I think in terms of the veteran value, it's one of those things. And actually, it is a thing in veteran versus in youth is perception matters. I think and that's one of the reasons why in my ranks, I kind of put the rookie, but then I also try to put the pick value in which I would take them. I think having that sort of pick value and that sort of capital does make a difference. And that's one of the reasons why, for me, I have a handful of those guys ranked highly, because I think it is about the combination of their youth, the things that they bring, the people, the players that they are and what they project to be. But then it's also just about the capital of which you're using for them. I mean, there always is that sort of level of investment. And I think having that sort of weight compared to the pick value does make a big difference to consider. And so, just like I've said, it's one of those things. It's just kind of hard to perfectly find the science for evaluating that sort of older player versus younger player. But that's why I do try to have sort of a balanced approach, is to be fair to all of these players and just, what they're able to bring. And, it really is just the reality that a handful of those, top 10 rookies that I have in the top 117, there's going to be at least a couple of them that probably are outside the top 100, even 2 months, 3 months into the season. It's just one of those things where, that can change so quickly, especially once we kind of separate the pick value from it. It just becomes one of those things where it's, again, it's an arbitrary game of figuring out who you want to have where and why.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I don't think we're saying, hey, if you're rebuilding, go get LeBron James, because that's silly, right?
Right.
It's knowing your roster. We'll talk about knowing your roster here in a little bit. Knowing your roster, though, where you're going, and then finding that value in those, I guess, price ranges or price points. I mean, I feel like price point, maybe talent points, maybe that's a better phrase. But you mentioned then downgrading prospects quickly. That kind of gets to the next question here. How quickly are you willing to downgrade younger prospects or players who maybe haven't really shown what we thought they could be capable of? Dalton Connect, Cody Williams were two players that it seems like, I don't know if you were overly aggressive compared to the community, but you certainly dropped them, I think, a fair bit. And Jaime Hawkins, you could throw in there too, who kind of had a bit of a sophomore slump. It seems like you're pretty quick, or I guess, let me rephrase it. Would you say you're pretty quick in adjusting downward if you just haven't seen enough in a prospect or young player to believe in them?
I think it kind of depends.
It depends. I was going to say it depends is a completely fair answer, because this is not, yes, you can use mathematical formulas or basic models to make, I think, a framework, but there's always going to be adjustments within that when you're talking about a sport.
Yeah. So I'm glad you actually brought up those guys in particular. And I'll tell you kind of what my thought process is on each of those. And, even before we started recording, I was looking at some of my old rankings from August of last year. And at the time, I had completely forgotten this, truth be told, but I had Jaime Hawkins as high as 125, I believe, is where I had him. So I guess I didn't fully realize how much I had dropped him from that time. But I will tell you that, when I consider a couple of those prospects, specifically in the examples of Jaime Hawkins and Dalton Connect, for me, one of those things that, and maybe I do just kind of overreact a little bit and push them down a little too far. But I will say that, for me on sort of those older prospects, I do sort of have some concerns, and I did have some concerns then. And I think, when you kind of get to this sort of slump that you see, it is easy to kind of overreact. I think in the case of Jaime Jaquez, it is one of those things where you just kind of see that decrease from early on. And you just kind of wonder, like, oh, geez, I don't know how much higher they can really go, or if they can kind of rebound to this if they've already, after seemingly proving in their rookie seasons that they are these capable rotation pieces or starters. And if they're not getting as much of that, was a lot of that sort of just a mirage, and that's one of those things you kind of look at with older prospects. And, maybe that's sort of the Chris Duarte effect on me, where it's like he comes on so strong, drops a little bit, and it's like, okay, they're just going to kind of get phased out. And you kind of wonder about, the case of Jaime Jaquez, where it's like, Nikola Jovic, all these other young players kind of coming in. It's like, is that guy still just going to keep getting phased out? Is he kind of going to hover around who he was as a sophomore? So it's one of those things, I think, with just those older prospects where it's hard to just kind of get a handle on exactly who they are. Ideally, when they sort of come in when they're 22, 23 years old, they kind of, I don't want to say are who they are, but, you sort of get a good snapshot early on of what is expected of them and what they're going to be doing, especially when they're going to be giving, presumably a higher role. And the same thing with Dalton Connect. I wasn't super high on Dalton Connect at the time. He's a very good scorer. He was, older coming in. But one of the, it was just sort of the intangibles of what I saw as a prospect, which was that he, was not a great defender. He was very like kind of almost a little bit landlocked into a role in terms of being a shooter. And that's sort of what he projected as, was sort of like a, like a Luke Kennard type, Max Strus type of guy. And that's just one of those types of players I'm not super high on personally for Dynasty. And so, it was already sort of a lower point at the start for me. What I kind of saw, especially after the, he had had that hot spike, and then he kind of dropped down, the, failed Mark Williams trade, all the way until now with sort of how, just to be blunt, he wasn't very good in summer league, and that's certainly concerning.
No,
as somebody
he was not. No, he was not.
Yeah, and like, as somebody who's going to be turning, I believe, 25 towards the end of this 2025-2026 season, it's one of those things I just have to consider really heavily in terms of that. If maybe they're just not as great as we think they're going to be. And so, just to kind of come full circle, it's one of those things where it does kind of depend. I think I am a little quick to react, especially with some older rookies. Tristan Da Silva being one I am kind of looking at for that. He is somebody I was a little bit lower on that maybe I should be a little bit higher on, I think. And that's one of the things I'm sort of considering for my next update, is that there are a couple of these guys I was a little low on. Da Silva being one, and then Cody Williams, like you mentioned, being the other. Very young, looked seriously improved in summer league, especially after the rookie season that he had. Hoping that he can just be a little better, especially as somebody who I did have graded a decent bit highly, both based on draft capital and based on my pre-draft evaluation, fantasy notwithstanding. And so, just to kind of come full circle on all this, it does really depend. I think sometimes for me, I have been a little quick to overreact. And that's one of those things that I, continue to work on, is just ensuring that I'm not overreacting too heavily to these players. But also just kind of doing what I can with that information of, okay, this person wasn't very good as a rookie, or, this person was really good as a rookie, not very good as a sophomore. What do I do now? And just kind of figuring out exactly where I stand on that in terms of what I want to do with that, and really where the value stands. Because like I mentioned earlier, perception really is everything. A lot of people were already out on Cody Williams. There's a lot of people who were already ready to drop him if they haven't already, in some shallower leagues. And so, it really is just consideration of, all factors of everything that you can. It really is an overthinking game with a lot of these guys,
Yeah. I liked how you did bring up perception, because I usually do or almost like 99% of the players I rank as, here's what I think their talent is.
Right.
That is not what I would probably necessarily like trade up for a player. For instance, Kasper Siakishonis is a rookie I have, I think, very highly rated, I think more highly rated than most other dynasty analysts in the community. Right. It doesn't mean I'm going to, I think I have him in the 70s. But since I know that everyone else is lower on him, and most general populace is, I don't need to go out of my way to get him in the 70s.
Right.
I had a recent salary 30-team league. When Kasper was still there at pick 21, and I ended up
Mm,
trading up for that. And yeah, I didn't trade up. I probably traded a bit more than what you would say pick 21 is worth. Traded
mhm.
Deron Holmes and then pick 32. But at the same time, if I think Casper Jonas was a player I would have seriously considered at like pick 4 or 5, that's a
Mhm.
pretty no-brainer trade from my end. So
Yeah.
balancing the perception, knowing, I guess, a rough market value of these players.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important thing. And I've even done the same. I'll give you a perfect example, similar to that. In one of my leagues, so we had kind of gotten to this point, and this was actually one of the leagues that I had covered recently in an article where I decided I wanted to fully tear the team down. And I was able to do that through like a really giant Tyrese Halliburton trade that'll let me tank for this year. So in this league, at that I had the 14th overall pick. I had picked 8th overall where I selected Derek Queen. And this was before I even made the Halliburton trade. So, I was already happy to make that pick as it was. After I had made that pick, I was able to trade for Tyrese Halliburton, in which I received Halliburton and the 14th overall pick. So when it got to the 14th overall pick, there were 2 guys left on the board that were much higher on my board than what was reflected on the draft currently, and that was Yegor Demon and Thomas Sorber, both who I thought should not have been available at the 14th overall pick.
Yeah, that's pretty surprising right there. That's a good value.
Yeah, yeah, and so with the 14th pick, I decided initially when I made that trade, I was like, if I could get Thomas Sorber, that is exactly who I'd want to pick. Especially needing more bigs. And so Thomas Sorber was there. I was like, I really want to take him. However, I am really going to struggle knowing that both these guys were on the board and I wasn't able to get both of them. So what I decided to do was I wanted to go after the 15th overall pick. And ultimately what that trade corresponded to was me trading Devin Carter, who I drafted, I believe, 12th overall in 2024, and Vince Williams Jr. for that pick to select Yegor Demon. I think as I reflect on it, and I have Devin Carter a little bit lower in my ranking, so I believe his value probably correspond closer to maybe like the 19th to the 20th overall pick, and Vince Williams, who again probably about like late first value, I guess you could say. I think in theory I did give up a little more than I should have or wanted to, just kind of based on the pick value. But that being said, I have Yegor Demon much higher. I have him believe closer to like 7th or 8th overall pick value. And so I was willing to pay a little bit more than I had to in order to get that player, because going back to what we said, perception, it doesn't always correspond exactly with value. There is this sort of idea that when we do these rankings, there is sort of a mathematical equation to understanding that, okay, if I'm going to get this top 100 player, I'm going to need to give a top 130 and a top 200. It doesn't always work like that. It sometimes it's just about whatever you're going to pay for and just kind of figuring out exactly what is the right balance to, especially when it comes to a draft. A lot of value goes out the window where people are willing to pay a little bit more in order to get that pick because they believe in that player, i.e. perception. And so really that's just kind of what so much of Dynasty comes down to, is just understanding that perception of yourself and what you value and how other people see those values.
I'm such a victim to that thinking, though, of, well, here are my rankings, and then, I shouldn't have to give up more than this, and then I
Right.
take a step back, and I'm like, okay, no, this is still a good trade. This is still fine. It's okay, and I think that's almost I think if you're going to take anything away from this rankings, it's that
Mm,
rankings are a guideline. They are not a Bible, a straight rubric. You have to follow them.
mhm.
I'm sure you mentally do the same. You kind of have these players in loose groupings. Just because he's 91st doesn't mean you would always take the 90th player over that 91st player. There's so many other factors you have to consider, and you can always, I kind of think of it as sliders. You can always
Yeah.
move the sliders in different direction: youth, veteran, center, guard. Okay, I need more boards, I need more assists. You can move these sliders as you want, and then that kind of
Mhm.
adjust the rankings a little bit in your head, just depending on what you're looking for. Or even,
Yeah.
hey, this player appears safe. I think I trust who he is, versus this player has a lot of range of outcomes and I'm not sure about that. And one might be better for your team or not.
Yeah, this has kind of been one of the things that's rattled in my brain a little bit recently, and I even posted it. Kind of going through that this dynasty mock draft that you and I have been doing with other people is this idea that startup value is not equal to regular value that's projected in rankings. Perfect example of that is a handful of my picks I've made recently with, OG Anunoby, with Brandon Ingram. Oftentimes, from my rankings, these guys are people that I have ranked, 20 plus spots ahead of some of the other guys who are going in these spots who are, a little bit younger. Perfect example being, and I'm just pulling the board up here on my side. So right after I selected Brandon Ingram, Bilal Coulibaly got picked. Bilal Coulibaly is somebody I have just outside of my top 100. I believe it's like 101, 102, something like that. Well, Brandon Ingram is somebody I have at closer to like 60. So, it just really is that idea that these young players are going to be coveted. And by default, when you're in sort of the startup environment, being able to hit on that value, and especially like in value picks, when you get to the middle of the round, you're looking for players who are going to be able to increase in value, not necessarily decrease, in order to get that, correct ROI, and so it really is just one of those things you just have to, like sliders, like you said. I mean, it really does just change so much based on, whatever the current move is, or whatever the current dynamic is that you're looking for. But yeah, I mean, value is just never it's never a list. I mean, despite the fact that we've kind of put these things in a list format or in a spreadsheet, it never is just fully coming down to that. It's so much more than that.
Yeah, and that's why I included notes. That's why you include notes, to give you, hey, here's a little bit extra information so you can maybe even judge these players for yourself a little more.
Exactly.
Speaking of the Dynasty mock draft, Zach here is participating in our Sports Ethos 12-team Dynasty Fantasy Analyst mock draft. I believe that's the full official title there. And coincidentally, Zach brought this up as we were talking before. Zach is on the clock at pick 106. So, yeah. So, Zach, I'm going to let you take the floor here and just walk through your thought process, maybe, incorporating some of the concepts we talked about here. But I'll let you take the floor, go through your thoughts, see who you're looking at, see what you're debating right here.
Yeah, man, most definitely. So I'm just looking at the board here. So currently, like you said, I am at 106. A lot of value taken, as you look just kind of right before me. Tumani Kamara's off the board, Con Knipple, Jimmy Butler, Shaden Sharp, Brandon Podjemski, Ben Matherin. So a lot of young players. Then before that, Jared McCain, Zach Edey. So yeah, a lot of stretch of young players. As I noted there, Jimmy Butler is going there. There is a lot of value left on the board, no doubt. As I sort of look at who is currently available, I do see some older players who are notable. Kawhi Leonard being one. We have other ones like Rudy Gobert, Julius Randle, Jakob Poeltl, Paul George, some kind of mixed age players. So that would be like Miles Bridges, Michael Porter Jr. Younger players like Anthony Simons are still on the board, DeAndre Ayton. There's a lot of different options that I could go. And as I look at sort of the younger side of the board, and I look at the team that I have so far, and for anybody who hasn't been following along, my team currently consists of Chet Holmgren, Tyrese Halliburton, Darius Garland, Bam Adebayo, Pascal Siakam, Scoot Henderson, OG Anunoby, and Brandon Ingram. Largely what I've done so far with this is scope out best values on the board, right? And just kind of finding that right balance of, like I mentioned, that sort of age balance, that, balance of production that they have right now, kind of looking at my rankings and just kind of based on where those things stand. So really not seeking anything in particular here. I think if I'm building for a team, there are certainly some options I have. And a few of the ones that I've sort of honed on that I'm really interested in would be guys like, as we mentioned at the top, Malik Monk is there, Jonathan Kuminga is there, Jeremiah Fears is there to, take a rookie if I was interested. Miles Bridges, like I mentioned, is one I have an eye on. Nick Claxton, Kawhi Leonard, Anthony Simons is one who is notable to me there as well. I think for my current team build, I've really prioritized a lot of defensive stats with my guys, a lot of assists so far. Handful of the guys that I've taken have that sort of out of position assist boost that I like. Seems like a lot of that's kind of straying towards that. I think as I sort of look at the board, I think the one who kind of checks a lot of those boxes for having a sort of younger piece who, checks a lot of those boxes for my build, checks out on the value side, is probably going to be Malik Monk. I think that's probably going to be the guy I ultimately take here. Currently at 106, he is about 20 to 30 spots above where I have him ranked in terms of my value. So that definitely checks out. As I mentioned, 5.6 assists last year. I think that is something that to some extent could be sustainable. I think that's possible. He is still pretty young. I believe he is 27 years of age as of today. I think Malik Monk's going to be the pick. I think that's going to be who I take. So yeah, Malik Monk, locked in pick there.
Yeah, I had him eighth at my board, so definitely like that pick and the value there. And yeah, I mean, appreciate you talking through that thought process.
Absolutely.
I also had Simons and some of these rookies here. Was there a reason, I guess, you went more for that? Just, it seems like, I guess, you're targeting that, I'm going to say mid-prime production, 27, 29 age profile. So that's just we were trying to lean into mainly with the Malik Monk, still being that 27, as you mentioned, still should have some good productive years ahead of him.
Yeah, so I think it kind of just does come down to that balance. I've, as I mentioned, I've seen a lot of the age kind of jumping off the board here. So, a lot of my guys like that I would probably have ranked around this 106 range would be, Kamara is gone. Somebody like Nikola Topic is already off the board. Devin Vassell's off the board. Zach Edey is off. So, for me, I think when you kind of, and like I mentioned with the startup value, it's not equal at all to, whatever I may list out. So, that's why there's been a lot of young players, and I can certainly understand, that element. But I do think, when you kind of get to some of these startups, that is one of those things that goes undervalued is, that veteran production. And so I think for me, it's just kind of seeing that value where it lies, assessing that, Malik Monk is still somebody who's in this prime that kind of fits with the theoretical build here. All these players are, fairly young to an extent. I believe Pascal Siakam is probably my oldest player, and I'm not sure if he's 30. He may be 29 or 30. But I do think having that guy is kind of like my oldest player, kind of ranging from this like 22 with Scoot Henderson to like 30, having that sort of correct balance in this theoretical build, I think works really well, along with just checking the boxes, statistically speaking. So yeah, that's sort of my ultimate thought process is just hitting on that value and then just knowing that I am getting this really positive production from that late 9th round spot. I think that's pretty good value on the whole.
Yeah, that all definitely makes sense there. I think this kind of transitions now into how managers should approach their own dynasty team. I mean, really off the top, it's assessing your own team, seeing where you're at. Because if you don't know where you're at, it's kind of hard to know where you're going.
Yeah.
I did not even mean to throw that cliche there, but we'll just roll with it. So I guess, what are the key components that you look at when you're evaluating your team? Is it the depth of your roster? Is it, okay, here are my core talent? Is it what future assets do I have? Or is it, again, it might be, it depends / all of the above.
Yeah. So to avoid saying all of the above for all the questions, I think the one of the key things that I always assess, and it's one of the things I've kept in mind a lot recently, is just having that blue chip talent is honestly, I think, where it comes down to. In my case, and I can kind of speak to the team that I had tore down that I mentioned here and that I've written about. For my team, I just really struggled having that blue chip talent. A few of the best guys that I had prior to my rebuild, that would be guys like, Scotty Barnes, Bam Adebayo, Tyler Hero. I drafted Stephen Castle. So just seeing a lot of that like divide, there's not like as much balance to that. It was a lot of guys who were kind of different age ranges, guys who were in kind of different places in terms of their production at the time, their context. I just was feeling like, especially being someone who was stuck in the middle of my league for so long, I just had to make a change. I felt like I was going to be stuck. I don't think I was going to be able to make any sort of, meaningful move if I was to make a trade. There wasn't really as much out there if I could secure like a top 40 or 50 guy. I didn't think that would really be enough to kind of push me back into the playoffs, especially considering that league is very top heavy, and a lot of teams are, really, really strong and have a lot of contending pieces, it was going to be some time until I was going to make the playoffs. And so I had just kind of called the audible, like, I really just need to change something about this team. I really need to hit on some picks. And that was part of the reason, with Derek Queen, I was like, I want to swing for the fences on some talent and get like a potential blue chip guy. If he could rise into maybe being like a top 40 guy, that could be something that makes a difference. However, it's going to be some time until that ultimately happens. Right. So I felt like I was going to be stuck in the middle of standings. I didn't want to keep picking like 8th or ninth every single year. Where I really like to be in my leagues is if I'm not winning, then I'm actively losing or tanking, so I can get a good pick and eventually win. So I think that's really where it comes from for me, is I don't like being stuck in the middle. And I think I feel that way about NBA teams as well. I think it's about kind of picking a lane and kind of sticking to that. And I felt like, for a lot of my young players, if I can trade away some of these key pieces, like, in my case where I traded Tyrese Halliburton, I traded Bam Adebayo. It's just about kind of capitalizing on that and just kind of seeing the value where it is. And, knowing that I can take this pick on Tyrese Halliburton, pick up some extra assets. And in turn, that makes me significantly worse in the short term so that I can make this pick that hopefully brings me up in the long term. And so, I think the lesson that I've really learned from that, and the lesson that people can take away, is that, sometimes you just have to lean as hard as you can into that, or just lean, where you can kind of get that value. If, there's an outcome that you're looking for, sometimes you just, got to make the call. You got to make the call saying, like, I don't want to pick 8th or ninth every single year. I'm going to decide that if I'm not going to be closer to 16th overall and making the playoffs, I'm much closer to, being stuck in the middle and not getting the picks that I want to find those difference makers. And so what I can really say is just that the right way to kind of assess it is just kind of, it really, sometimes it's just like an emotional thing. I felt like I was just frustrated with my team, and I decided I don't want to be picking every single year like this. My team is not good. It's not where I want it to be. And I'm going to make that change. And I think that's really honestly like where it starts. If you just kind of see in the stats and in the numbers, like, I'm not going to be performing the way that I want to. Finding that way to kind of make that change is kind of where I stand. And it's much easier said than done. It's a tough decision, especially when you are, you have these teams and it's easy to get attached to them. Sometimes you just have to do some soul searching. And for me, that's kind of what it came down to, was just deciding that I needed to make that change.
I think that, it's weird to say, emotionally, that's almost the way you go with that gut call, but I actually think it's a really good way to summarize it. It's kind of, when you see it, you see your team up on the Fantrax screen or whatever platform you're on, and you just look at your team and you're like, this is not good. This is, I don't want to just say garbage, but like, this is a teammate winning. It's like, pull up the Bulls roster and see this team isn't going anywhere. I've used the Bulls as my poster child for how not to rebuild your fantasy team. I would apologize to Bulls fans out there, but I also think you all know the state that y'all are in. So I hope you're not a Bulls fan, Zach, if you are.
No, I'm a Cavs fan, thankfully. I'm very privileged these days.
Yes. No, you all, I think Cavs have been, actually, Kobe Altman has, I think, redeemed himself well from that Kevin Love contract.
I'll say, sure. He's definitely come up.
Man, I know you made that point. It's just, you look at your team and you say, I don't have the talent here. Something's got to change. And kind of looping that back, the emotional side, seeing your roster, knowing it's not in a good spot because you evaluated that you don't have that elite talent to build around. Now, you could have a case you have so much depth that it just overwhelms your league, but usually that's probably more league specific, that your league starts a lot of players and you happen to have the depth, and that depth is stable enough that it works out. I think it's more of maybe a smaller league, so 12 or 14 team strategy. I tend to play more, 20, really all my dynasty leagues, I think, are 30 teams. So you kind of do need some blue chip talent and then some cheap contributors to chip in, but you need that upper echelon talent that's going to be able to just win you matchups not on their own, but be a huge reason why. And that's the same way I look at my rosters. I definitely had some rosters last season that they didn't have the talent, and I leaned into the tank. I traded off players at what I thought were fair value, or I was willing to hold on to them while I shifted my scope. So
Yeah, it's I'm glad you brought that up about the depth too, because sometimes it is kind of hard to assess depth, especially when you play in shallower leagues or deeper leagues. You know, sometimes there is sort of this element, and especially you see it a lot in trades where people will approach, let's say you have the piece that they're looking for. A lot of times, what people will come with, and one of the defaults is to, try a 2-for-1. So like they take two of their players that maybe aren't as equal to, the main player that you're looking for. And it's not easy to get done, because oftentimes people don't want to always break up that key player to get those pieces. And I think that's just one of the things to look at as well as for Dynasty is, sometimes having this depth can be a challenge. You almost like there is sort of like this balance you need to find between having this blue chip talent and, like you mentioned, having good depth, but not too good, because there's going to be a lot of guys that you may not be starting every single week. And so if you're not going to be using all these guys, it's like, why amass the depth? And that's why you kind of look for the key contributors and the cheap ones like waiver pickups. I can say for me, I'm a fiend on some of the waivers in my leagues. I love waiver pickups. I've gotten really lucky on a handful of them with like Gershon Yabusele in recent years, and like Jalen Clark, like guys like that. That's always one of my favorite things when I play in like a 24 team or like a 30 team league, is just finding those cheap contributors and just having something with them. I mean, it helps so much when you play in these deeper leagues where it's like waiver wires are just so dry and like you need any sort of contributor that you can find. Depth is just, it's a hard thing. I think that's honestly one of the hardest things to always assess when you play Dynasty, is just knowing where you stand on depth and like being able to trade depth, move around for depth, how you can use that depth for blue chip pieces. It's not easy for sure.
Yeah, it is almost, you're on a nice edge where you almost can't tell yourself, oh, I need to make sure I'm secure if this player gets injured. If your
Right.
key player gets injured, I'm gonna use the Pacers. If Tyrese Halliburton goes down, you're not really going anywhere. And like
Right.
that's not, I don't know if that's not cool to say. I think it's truth. It's your team's probably not going anywhere, and that's just how it is. Celtics
Right.
with Tatum, your key player goes down. It sucks. It's hard to bounce back from that unless your other opponents happen to also have injuries. And
Right.
you have to accept that reality. So I think now shifting from, you've assessed your team, you've looked at your state of the team. If it's great, good, you contend, you keep adding. I think that's almost kind of the easier part. I think
Mhm.
actually the harder part, and this is kind of converse from the NBA, I think it's actually kind of harder to sometimes do a rebuild that puts you in a good position. And so I
Mhm.
loved, you all released kind of a Dynasty Handbook Volume 1, and you discussed selling and tanking players. And the point I really love from that, and it's something I stress as well, is know your player's worth. Just don't sell to sell. Because who knows, maybe veteran players bounce back, they do well. Like, I'm going to use Zach LaVine here.
Mhm.
I think his value was pretty low last offseason rather. A lot of
Mhm.
managers are saying, oh, is he going to bounce back? What's his role? What's his usage? I personally thought that he was going to bounce back. I didn't, could have maybe sold him low in some leagues, but I held on to him, and now his value is higher. And which is weird to say about, he's a player who's 30, 31. Normally you see those players go down, but his value, I think, is pretty much higher now than it was last offseason.
Mhm.
And so if you're in a rebuilding team, but you have some of these aging assets, what is your key advice to managers who, you're not there, you need to do that tear down? How do you approach these assets? Because you probably do eventually want to sell them for some more future focused value,
Mhm.
but you can't just hold on to them though, because eventually they're going to start plummeting off. How do you deal with that, I guess? Or what's your advice to managers who are trying to rebuild and they have those aging assets?
Yeah, I really think the key is, and the truth of the matter is, there's never a obvious right time to sell for a lot of players. There's always the chance that they can rebound. There's always, there never is sort of like that right equation to knowing that like this is the move that like in which I should be selling, or like whatever that may look like. I think it's really just about knowing what you have, knowing like the value that you have, what it would represent for teams who, would be contending, that would look for the sort of that value. And really just not letting it burn a hole in your pocket, like you mentioned. I think it's easy to make trades just to make them sometimes, myself included. I mean, I think that's the case for all of us, where we're like, oh man, it'd really be nice to like make a move, or really be good just like trade this while I can still get some value. I think for me, it's really just about, and I mentioned a couple times, is, sort of assessing this value where it is and just kind of acknowledging it. I think, in a lot of cases, if you have like, let's say like, just to like pick like an example of an older player, like you're looking to sell maybe like a Jimmy Butler, right? And like that's kind of your guy where like, if you trade him away, that's kind of like your last piece to fully rebuild. It's hard to, you're very rarely going to be able to get perfect value that you love for Jimmy Butler. I think anyone would love if, just kind of looking at like my rankings, for example, I have Jimmy Butler, just looking here, like 104. I mean, in a perfect world, if you could get Bilal Coulibaly straight up for him, or you could get the 7th overall pick, kind of looking at like players around him, that would be, amazing if you're able to do that. And maybe you are, but sometimes it's going to be hard to sort of sell for that. So if somebody's like comes back and they're like, I'm not really interested, like I'll give you, I don't know, like someone in like, I'm just looking at like my 130s or 140s, like I'll give you like, Quentin Grimes for him or something like that, then that's where you're kind of like, I don't know, like it's not perfect. I think for me, it's not about, if you're not totally happy with the return you're getting, you don't have to do it. I think like part of the dynasty that you do have to consider is that fun is a part of it. And, knowing that like you can kind of get what you want for those things is important. And so, it kind of is about this balance. Certainly sometimes where you do need to sell a little bit lower, if like you need to get to this end goal. Like, let's say like, if you're me and I'm finishing like 7th still out of like 24, and I'm still not as low as I want to be. Speaking in my case, I had Brook Lopez on that team. And somebody had offered me like 2 second round, like late second round picks, and like Jalen Tyson. Value wasn't perfect for me at the time, last year when I made that trade, but I was like, you know what? I mean, it kind of is time to sell. Like, I'm worried about Brook Lopez. I don't know how his health is going to hold up. I don't know what his pending free agency would have looked like. We know now, but back then it's like I had no idea what it was going to look like. So I was like, I want to make sure I'm getting correct value for this. And so I decided to ultimately take it, not totally sure if the value I got was correct. Seems I did make the correct call in the end, just kind of based on his current situation. But, there are sort of these things you have to make sometimes in these gambles where you're like, okay, well, it's not quite the value that I want, just kind of based on my rankings, but this is going to be the opportunity. So sometimes opportunity cost is an important part of it. It's just assessing that, knowing like when the right time to sell is, if it's, if you can wait a little bit to kind of hold out, hoping that they'll increase their value, or, maybe like if they're going to outperform, in certain cases, knowing that you can sell a little bit better in like a couple of months or something like that, closer to the deadline. And so it's really just about assessing the time, just kind of knowing the timeline you're on, and just being able to sell, without like making some sort of like knee-jerk reaction. Just really considering like all sides of it is kind of what I would say.
Yeah, and I think you said something towards the top of that, which I really liked. It triggered another thought, but it's like know your player's worth, but then maybe also think of it from what is a contending team getting from this player? So you mentioned Jimmy Butler. Yeah, if you're rebuilding, it's like, okay, well, who cares that he gets me, efficient points, good free throw percentage, good boards, good assist. A contending team, think about that. That contending team's getting a huge beef up in all those categories. And you get reliability. I would assume fairly reliability with him having the contract on the Warriors. We'll assume that, but I mean that's a good player that can definitely change that team's playoff outcomes. And you're telling me you're not going to give up like a Bilal Coulibaly for that, who could just maybe phase out of the Wizards this year? I mean, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but it's in the realm of possibilities for Coulibaly. You're really telling me as a contender you're not going to do that? Come on, so you can play that aspect up, or think about that contending team too. So I think that's a flip side is, again, know what these players are providing, and they normally do provide something pretty good, unless they're completely kind of now like Clint Capella, Brook Lopez, they're past their prime now. At that point, you probably just got to accept what you can get. But there's definitely some players that are still strong today.
Yeah, I mean, like we've mentioned it a handful of times. Value is not perfect. Rankings are not going to be perfect. I mean, you know, y- and that's even the case with someone like a Kawhi Leonard. I mean, maybe somebody like Jimmy Butler. You could certainly make the case like for some people where it's like, oh, Jimmy's had like all these like injuries. He's kind of taken a little bit of a downtick with being in Golden State. Um, with somebody like even like a Kawhi Leonard who has, sort of that better production. And, when he does play, he is, much closer to that like elite level. Um, it's the same thing where it's like, even though I have him ranked 77th, I don't think that you could honestly approach somebody who had like, let's say like Jared McCain, just to like name a player that I have like just directly under Kawhi Leonard, or even someone higher like Stephen Castle. I don't think if you were able to approach them and be like, hey, I have Kawhi Leonard, you're a contender, give me Stephen Castle. Like it might be kind of a hard sell to get that from them, knowing that like, there are always all these different like ticks against Kawhi Leonard, knowing that like, if you're buying him, you're sort of getting this, potentially damaged good, thinking that, it's this guy who's not going to be able to play a lot. It's hard sometimes to kind of get exactly what you're looking for and just kind of finding that value. I mean, it's just one of the things that's so difficult about Dynasty is just being able to approach people and just have them think almost from your perspective in that way, knowing that like, I value them in this way, and they'll come back and be like, oh, well, I value him like much closer to like Bilal Coulibaly. It's just one of those things where it's hard to really just sort of find common ground in that way to make those perfect trades. And so I guess all that to say, it's hard to find a perfect trade, when you're sort of in that rebuilding situation, just looking for some sort of value. And sometimes the value is kind of baked into knowing that if you get them off your roster, then you're going to be much worse, therefore getting a better pick. Sometimes that's just kind of baked in.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and I'm sure you've experienced this. I know that I've experienced this where I go to a manager, I say, hey, here's a trade that I think would be good for your team. And, maybe you try to slant it a little in your favor, but you think it's in the realm. And they're just like, nope, I don't like that player. Or I don't want to give up this player. This player is my crown jewel. And it's just like, all right, well, that just ends negotiations there. Clearly, we're on very different wavelengths. So, or sometimes like, hey, we're close. And then you hash out the negotiations and you end up adding other pieces and other players and you end up making it work. But at least have the conversation, scour your league. You can look at the top of the standings, see if you're trying to sell, say, hey, okay, this team could actually use like a LeBron James or Jimmy Butler. Or if you're trying to buy, look at the bottom teams. I did that in one league where I had DeJounte Murray get injured last season, and I scoured the bottom teams. I saw Jalen Brunson. I'm like, all right, cool. Do DeJounte Murray plus some other assets. Can we make something work? And that worked out because DeJounte Murray helps him tank, and then Jalen Brunson helped me now. Well, I also gave up other assets too, but it was a player that I needed, and it helped a little bit. Didn't fully work out, but conceptually scour the league and ask those questions and just see what happens, see what conversations happen.
Yeah, I can definitely speak to that too. I had DeJounte Murray on a team. It was a team where I had, a lot of really good players that, I'd sort of risen up all of a sudden after, kind of being like a little bit of a middling team for years. So I had like LaMelo Ball, I had DeJounte Murray, I had Denny Avdia, Daniel Gafford, Bilal Coulibaly. I had all these guys and I was doing, really well. Unfortunately, after, DeJounte gets hurt, I have all these, typical LaMelo Ball, missed all the missed time. I felt like, even though I was still contending, I was like, I need to make some sort of move to, push in the chips because I am like, the second best team in my conference. I have this huge opportunity in a 30 team to be able to win it all. So I was like, well, let's make a trade. Let's find something that I can do. And so ultimately, what I was able to do was I sold DeJounte Murray and Bilal Coulibaly to get Kevin Durant, and that ended up being such a big move for me. I still ended up losing in the semis, but sometimes you just have to make those moves in the calls. Realistically, did I give up the value that I should have given up for someone like Kevin Durant? Giving Bilal, giving DeJounte Murray. Maybe not. It's hard to really say, but I do feel like based on the opportunity cost and what was presented to me, knowing that this would be the difference maker between potentially, falling to like the 8th seed in the playoffs, or conversely, being someone who can contend and potentially win the championship. I'm picking the championship. If I'm that close, I'm like, even though I'm paying a little bit more than ordinarily I'd want to, this is the opportunity. This is what's available to me. And I think this is the move that's going to help me. And so that's really, that's a lesson you can take from a contending team, from a rebuilding team. It's just about finding those moves that really are the correct opportunity cost. And, when it's presented to you, just knowing like what the doors it opens will do for you.
For sure. And I mean, yeah, they say banners fly forever, but they do.
They do.
And then you can hang on that for a while. All right. Now, hey, I mean, if you're playing a money league too, that those winnings normally do help you just maybe make some fun moves later on or enjoy it too. So that's
Most
something
definitely
else to keep in your back of your mind.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Last topic. We're getting a little long here, so maybe we'll try to keep this a little shorter. But I think it's a great conversation too.
Mm-hmm, definitely.
But last topic here is how to find gems and talent. You mentioned waiver wires are barren. Obviously, if you're in bigger leagues, you only got a limited number of assets to try to find these talents.
Right.
What aspects do you look for when you're trying to find these stashes, when you're trying to be that fiend on the waiver wires or lower end draft picks, or even limited minutes players to identify this emerging talent that could rise up rankings later?
I think a lot of it really just does come down to being very active in basketball in general, and just kind of paying attention to what you're seeing. I can name a couple of the examples like I named. I'm happy to kind of go through my process. Was Gershon Yabusele. I had seen how he had played in the Olympics. I was like, this guy is really good. Like even though like things didn't work out for his first stint in the NBA, like this is a guy. This is a guy that clearly is somebody who can come to the NBA, potentially be a difference maker, even if he's like an 8th or 9th man. In the grand scheme of things, in like a 30-team league, that can still pay a lot of dividends to find a guy like that who can play like real minutes and give you real production. So I was like, you know what? Yeah, we'll pick him up. I saw how he played and I was like, yeah, let's just give it a try, see what happens. The opportunity will be there. Sure enough, it did present itself when he got signed to the 76ers. And it was just so much better than I even could have possibly thought, So, that was one case where being just super plugged in and just seeing how well he was playing and knowing that.
Yeah, I did the same. No, I did the same thing with Yabusele where saw him in the Olympics. I'm like, okay, this guy actually, he looks like a dude. He looks like an NBA player.
Absolutely.
And then once he got signed to the Sixers, that was a good landing spot. I blew my entire 100% of my free agency budget on him.
Wow.
And I mean, did it seem maybe too much? I overbid. Technically, I overbid because I could have gotten him for less, but
right.
I don't care now. I got a player that I would think is like I don't want to say must roster, but I mean, he definitely should be rostered in 30-team leagues.
Yeah.
And hey, if you get that player off the waiver wires and he's now like a good roster for the next 2-3 seasons, I don't care that I spent that $100 at Fab.
Exactly. So, I mean, that's one of the things that I've talked about before in articles is, and in fact, I think I'd even mentioned this in my rebuild article where it's like, it's so much better to overpay than underpay when you're looking for waiver wire pickups, because you're going to be riding that high forever, even if you overspend. Who cares if you spent like $10 more on Gershon Yabusele than if you spent like $1 less missing out on him, and knowing that like your ultimate like contender, like a rival and like, contendership is, picking up this guy over you. That's just something you're going to think about forever. You're like, I should have just like bid a little more. And, that's just one of those things where it just, sometimes it's just, it's okay to get your guys, it's okay to get your guys.
I'm thinking
so for me, that was
thinking of that, the meme where the guy's like popping the champagne, celebrating.
Yeah.
And then like, he's like 10th on the podium looking up. I'm kind of thinking about that right there. It's like, oh, I got Yabusele with all my Fab, and you're there like going crazy. And it's like, it's the off season. But I feel the same way too. It's like, yes, I got that guy that's like 280th in my rankings and could go higher. Let's go. Big wins.
Yeah. And that was one of the things I had done, especially this year. My other example, Jalen Clark, is, he was somebody that I was interested in for a little bit, when he was a rookie, even though, despite the fact that he tore his Achilles, he was somebody who was just so good defensively in college that I was like, there's just has to be a way that a guy like this, who's so good defensively, who just is like a dog and is like, hopefully working on his 3-point shot. Like there is a realistic chance that this guy could come in, have a really good fantasy game, find a really good role. It's possible. And so, for me, it was just, kind of paying attention to that. That was one of the things that I liked about Jalen Clark. But then, for a lot of people, what came into awareness was just watching him. I mean, he's such a hard player. It's so easy sometimes if you just watch some of the games where you can just pick out and be like, that's not an NBA guy. And I think for me, it's just this, even though I had this sort of belief in Jalen Clark before that like he could be a really good stash, it's kind of seeing that in action, whether that's in summer league, whether that's like on the court in, actual like legitimate important basketball for a playoff team. And you're seeing that this guy can hold his own and play really well, where you're like, that is so obviously a guy, that is a guy who is really good. And so, just speaking so much to that. And so there is sort of that backup, but I think that's one of the biggest things, just kind of studying the stats, kind of watching what's out there, being able to just kind of watch them in person and just see like, this guy doesn't get a lot of minutes, but he plays really hard and he plays well and he has like someone's respect. And that's one of the things that I do focus on a lot. And early on when I kind of ranked Jalen Clark and kind of pushed him up, I pointed out that like, Chris Finch is like a stickler for his rotation. He plays very tight, 7-8.
Yes, he does.
Yeah, I mean, he plays very, very tight rosters, 7-8 men. The fact that he's giving Jalen Clark opportunity at all means something pretty significant. And so that's why I told people, I was like, the fact that this is happening is very meaningful and it's something that we have to account for. And so, kind of just going back to the very beginning, it's the consideration of all these things, the stats, how they play, the way that they look, the context of which they're kind of getting these opportunities. It's one of the things you can just kind of look for as you get really good at, Dynasty in general, and just kind of being on the up and up for like who's playing well and just kind of checking out the stats every night. Is just, you'll see these little glimmers of things and you'll think maybe that is something. And, there's a lot of times I probably had more misses than my hits, but it's like, I don't think about the misses anymore. I'm just going to think about that. I was very early to the beat on Yabusele. I was very early on Jalen Clark. And so, it's just about just thinking these things through and just hitting. It really is just sort of a quantity thing. If you just hit so many, eventually you'll find like someone who's going to stick around.
For some reason that reminded me of the quote from Wolf of Wall Street where Leonardo DiCaprio's character is like trying to sell the first penny stock or whatever. And he's like, I ask my clients not to judge me on my misses, but judge me on my hits.
Absolutely.
Well, when you're in the lower ranges of the waiver wires or stashes, or like your second to last man on your roster, you're not looking for players that maybe make it. You're looking for just players that will get opportunity and have a chance to prove something.
Right.
And to almost boil down a complex answer, it felt like, a simple way to summarize it is looking for players you can provide something to NBA teams.
Yeah.
And that can be, that's a whole nother rabbit hole of player evaluation,
right?
Whether it's shooting, the defense of Jalen Clark, the ball handling of passing, or rim defense or size. There's so many factors that can go there. But can that player provide something to NBA teams? And you can get that from watching the game, seeing a guy like Jalen Clark just be the quote unquote SGA stopper. But like Chris Finch actually deployed him to put him in the last second possession to guard SGA it was like a February game, I think. And it's like, yeah, that says something. Seeing Yabusele actually show something different for the French national team. And the fact that he was kind of closing over more established names, I think he closed over Rudy Gobert.
Mm-hmm.
That says something. FIBA is a different game slightly with the rules, but that still says something. So seeing what those coaches tell us, seeing what skills these players can provide to NBA teams, that's how you can, I think, find those stashes. I think that's actually a pretty fair way to summarize it in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's a great way to summarize it.
How you go about it? Go ahead.
No, yeah, you're good. Yeah, that really is just the perfect way to summarize it, is just, seeing the skills that they can provide. And I think that's one of the reasons why, personally, I feel like a lot of the things that I do for like scouting with like the NBA draft and the things that, all of us at Dizzle Dynasty do is like, we pay attention to a lot of the scouting elements. And that's one of the things that really is important to us as we look for these things is, what sort of value can they provide an NBA team? And that's one of the things that you look at for Dynasty as well. You kind of look for these guys to provide real skills, real pieces, these points of value. And you just kind of run with it. That's part of the reason like someone like, like Young Hansen, was able to rise up so highly, even though I feel I wasn't as high on that pick for Portland. He has this sort of outlier passing skill. And when you kind of look at those things, that does matter a lot, that high draft capital, that outlier skill, you have to think at some point, like that is a guy for sure, even though like I've thought maybe he isn't, And it's just really about just assessing those skills and just watching for anything that you can in terms of those skills. It's fairly quick to see if someone, even like an older player after a couple years is still not an NBA guy. It's hard. They probably won't ever be a guy. I mean, that's just kind of how it works. It's just about looking at who the guys are, identifying who the guys can be, and really just like what they can morph into. I mean, that's just really such a key part of Dynasty, is just being able to watch and see that kind of play out in real time.
For sure. And it's, as you said, watching these players, even from the NBA draft scouting, but even just early on in players' careers. Yes, that can even be during silly season. Seeing what these players are actually, what are they doing that can last? What is sustainable, or what is an NBA team going to key on? And an NBA team could value that. That's players' calling card or pathway to minutes.
Right.
That's a chance for opportunity, and then maybe you see future growth, and then maybe that player emerges into something more.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, silly season, at any point of the season, you can learn different things. And I mean, there's been plenty of silly season guys who never hit, but the few that do, I mean, it's what it is. You find these guys and you just glean what you can. I mean, there's always going to be things in Dynasty that do not work in your favor, or things that, you make this move and, years later you think, that wasn't really that good of a move. But it's just about doing what you can with the information at the time.
Yeah, I think that's just the core of what you can do. I mean, I think any of us can look back in hindsight and be like, oh my gosh, why did I make that trade?
Right.
For instance, I traded away Tyrese Halliburton for Christian Wood some years ago. And of course, I look back on that and think, what was I thinking? I have a lot of lessons learned from that trade, but I think that was like 2021 or something, 22. A lot of lessons learned, but hey, it's go back, look, what can you change from that process? What would you do going forward? And just seeing what you would do with the information at that time. It's all you can do, and then try to make those best assessments going forward.
Yeah, I mean, it's just about learning from it. I mean, there really is just such an important emphasis on learning lessons from everything you do in Dynasty. I mean, one of my probably least favorite trades, I mean, I've certainly made some bad ones, as we all have, but one I don't look too fondly on is the fact that I traded down. So I in the 2024 draft, Zachary Risager was on the clock, and I was going to be able to take him, but I decided to trade down one spot to pick up an extra second. So, while this other manager took Zachary Risager, I took Cody Williams and I took Tyler Smith. Both of those guys who are, not great assets right now. I mean, both guys who are kind of in that top 260 to 300 range. Well, Risager, he's doing great. He's got a great future ahead of him. And so, it happens to the best of us. I mean, I felt like just looking at my big board and, for the draft and also for fantasy, I'm getting good value in this, but it turns out that it was just it's already a miss entirely. I mean, let's call it what it is, and it's just about learning the lessons and just understanding that, maybe don't let the first overall pick fall that low, but also just knowing that, if there is sort of this value where there is this significant piece that's on the board who could contribute, sometimes it's best not to just overthink it. If that's the guy you think is better, don't forego that so that you can add a little bit of extra depth. It's just about, picking out those lessons and just figuring out how you can be better for it.
For sure. And we'll go ahead and call it for this episode of the Punt Intended podcast. Zach, it's been great having you on. I thought this was great information and a lot of just things for managers to chew on as they're evaluating their rosters or looking at what decisions or how they should make them even. Is there anything else you want to shout out over at Dizzle Dynasty?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for having me on, man. This has been a fantastic conversation, and I appreciate all of the time. I know we kind of went over a little bit, but it was good. It was good talking with you and all this stuff. We've got a lot going on over here at Dizzle Dynasty. You can find us pretty much anywhere: Twitter, Substack, at Dizzle Dynasty. We've got a lot we've got cooking up. Currently, we've started our series where we're going through all the different divisions in the NBA and just kind of covering, the happenings, what's going on. We've got a lot of articles we've been posting with some player spotlights, kind of going through some different things. And then we have some video content we're looking to start dropping in early September. So stay tuned for that. We've got some really cool video stuff we've got for you guys. Kind of a new foray for us as we've, spent a lot of time on kind of the short and long form writing stuff. But Video is a new avenue that we're just looking into. And we'll be really excited to share some stuff with you guys. You definitely won't want to miss it.
I will definitely be on the lookout for that myself. Looking forward to all that content. And hey, we'll have your Substack linked in the show notes, so be sure to check out Dizzle Dynasty and all the content they're putting out. Mentioning show notes, and on YouTube, if you're watching on YouTube, please leave that like button, subscribe to the podcast. Stuff really does help the growth. Comment on some of this stuff. If you like Zach and you want to see him on more, let us know, and we'll plan some future episodes with him. If you're listening on audio, leaving a rating, review, subscribing, all that stuff really does help the growth and would be very much appreciated. But until next time, we'll see you on the Punt Intended podcast presented by FanDuel.